Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian from the Reference Department at Beebe Library. Once again, I'm bringing you armchair travel since we're all stuck at home for several weeks. And I thought you would enjoy seeing a little bit of the world from the comfort of your living room. WCAT here in Wakefield has generously partnered with Beebe Library to help us continue to bring our programming to you in any way we can. And I'm pleased to have you join me today for a tour of County Cornwall in England. If you'd like to see more armchair travel, I hope you'll follow me on Instagram at #the_traveling_librarian. And I also hope once the library reopens, you will join me for monthly travel programs there as well. Now we're going to visit Cornwall at the extreme southwest corner of England. This is part of a trip that I took in the fall of 2019, where we visited a number of different various groups of friends in that part of England, in Oxfordshire, Somerset, and Cornwall as well. Believe it or not, Cornwall is actually only about the size of Rhode Island. Here's an overview image of the outline of Massachusetts over the southwest corner of England, so you can kind of get an idea of the approximate size. There's slightly more than 500,000 people, and that makes it one of the smallest counties by population in all of England. It's not a very large county. There's only about 75 miles from the Devon border to the extreme tip of Land's End over in the west. It is bounded on the east by Devon, and its capital, Truro, is actually, it's a very nice town, but it's smaller even than Wakefield. Unlike Welsh, the Cornish language is hardly evident. When you travel around Cornwall, you will not really hear Cornish spoken. There's only a few hundred people who speak Cornish at this point, whereas in Wales, the Welsh language is still alive and well to a large degree. But in Cornwall, you will not see dual language signs, and you will rarely hear people speaking Cornish anywhere. One of the most important sites in Cornwall is Bodmin Moor, a national park in the center uplands of the peninsula, and we will visit that in a few minutes. Everywhere that you go in Cornwall, you will find Cornish pasties, which are very filling meat or vegetable pies that were once used by tin miners. They have an interesting background to them. You can see they have a sort of crimped edge to the pastry. And the idea was that back in the days when tin mining was very popular and an important industry in Cornwall, the miners took these very filling meals down into the mines, and they're enclosed, which makes them safer to eat. The filling is enclosed inside the pastry, and they would eat everything but the crimped edge, because arsenic was a common substance in the tin mines, and if you got it on your hands, you were vulnerable to arsenic poisoning. So if you held the pasty by the crimped edge and then discarded it when you're done, that reduced the risk of your getting arsenic poisoning. Another thing that you'll find all over Cornwall, as elsewhere in England, is cream teas. These are even more famous in Devon, as you might have learned if you've seen my Devon program. They involve homemade scones, fruit, which is fruit jams, which are usually strawberry or something like that, and clotted cream that you can see in the little container up on the right, and a freshly brewed pot of good English tea. In Cornwall, unlike in Devon, the tradition is that once you split the scone, you put the jam on first, and then you put the clotted cream on top of that. In Devon, it's the other way around, and as a tourist, you probably don't really have to worry about that. They're pretty lax about letting tourists do whatever they want. We're going to start on the north coast of Cornwall in a town called Tintagel, which is a very tiny village. Unfortunately, it's extremely touristy, but that doesn't mean you should skip it. It's a beautiful little town. This is the old post office, one of the oldest buildings in the village that goes back to the 14th century. It's now a little gift shop and tourist museum. The village has all kinds of stuff aimed at people who like the Arthurian legends, because, as we'll see shortly, Tintagel Castle is very closely connected to King Arthur and all the legends of Camelot. So unfortunately, you can find all kinds of tourist crap that you can buy, including plastic swords, all kinds of crystals, geodes, all that kind of stuff. But the big highlight is the dramatic scenery that you can see up and down the coast. And again, remember, we're on the north coast of Cornwall. So you're looking north towards the southern coast of Wales. The building that you can see up on the upper right is the Camelot Hotel that was built in 1899 with a view of the castle. The Victorian era was when Tintagel really started to become popular as a tourist destination. The headland is very dramatic, and you can see from the scale of the cliffs from the tiny little people way up at the top. There's not really much left of the castle at this point except some ruined walls. And there is controversy about the castle. The ruins that are there today date about probably to the 13th century, when the castle was built as a fortification. And Geoffrey of Monmouth, back in the Middle Ages, was one of the first people to help really reinforce the idea that this site was connected to King Arthur. And the main legend is that Arthur was conceived here in the castle that was on this site. There is a new steel footbridge that you can see crossing the gap. That was just opened last summer in August of 2019. Many people actually hate that because they feel that it detracts from the scenery. And the good thing, though, is it does actually make it, particularly for people with disabilities, it makes it much easier for people to get back and forth to the headland, because before that, you would have had to go down that extremely long flight of steps on one side and then up the cliff on a similar flight of steps on the other. The views, as I mentioned, are just incredible, even though there is very little left of the castle itself, except foundations. At the very tip of the headland is a statue of King Arthur that was installed a few years ago by a British artist. It guards the headland ominously and is quite dramatic. In addition to the Arthur legends, there are other things connected with this site. This particular foundation that you can see here is what remains of a garden enclosure at the castle. And legend has it that Tristan and Isolde, the famous medieval romance, is connected to this site because the characters actually walked here. Whether that's true or not is probably something you should take with a grain of salt. As is true also if you climb down the stairs and go down into the little cove. There is a natural cave that you can see people going into on the left that's known as Merlin's Cave. And of course, this natural cave has nothing to do whatsoever with the fictional character of Merlin, but it does make a fun place to explore. And there are just, again, amazing views, which you will probably not be the only people there, as you can see from here. You'll be there with hundreds of other people, particularly on a gorgeous day like the day that we were there. We're going to keep heading west towards the tip of the peninsula, and the first place we're going to stop is Bodmin Moor, which is about 80 square miles of national park and moorish uplands with a lot of granite and outcrops. The first thing that we'll see is an outcrop that you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. It's called Row Tor. It's spelled R-O-U-G-A, but it's pronounced Row. A tor is a granite outcrop, and this one and the nearby Brown Willie are the two highest points in all of Cornwall. Both of them are around 1,400 feet. The whole area is very wild and windswept. It's been inhabited since Neolithic times, and you can see a lot of untamed wildlife, sheep, cows, horses, and a variety of other things, birds as well. The weird rock formations that you can see are actually entirely natural. There's a few places on the site, and we'll see those in a few minutes, that are actual Neolithic man-made structures, but the vast majority of the strange rock formations that you see are entirely natural outcrops of granite that has been weathered by the elements, particularly wind and water. The hike that we took up to the top of Row Tor was a day that was unbelievably windy. The winds were probably a good 40 miles an hour, and it was pretty chilly. But at least it was a good day to get spectacular views in every direction. This particular site also figures prominently in the dramatic conclusion of Daphne du Maurier's famous novel Jamaica Inn, which has also been turned into at least a couple of different TV and film versions as well. The rocks that you can see are actually incredibly large. It's hard to get a sense of scale until you're right up next to them. The hill off in the distance is Brown Willie, the one that's actually the highest point in all of Cornwall, slightly higher than Row Tor that we're standing on. And if it hadn't been so windy, we would have made an effort to get over to it, but it's a good 1.5 miles away. And on a windy day, it just didn't seem worth it. Again, here you can get a sense with a human in the picture of just how big these rock formations are and how windy it is. There's lots of sheep, cattle, and also semi-wild ponies that roam Bodmin Moor as well. In the center of Bodmin Moor, the moor itself is roughly circular, and if you look right smack in the middle of it, there is a road that crosses from east to west, and in the middle is the famous Jamaica Inn. The current one that we're looking at right now is a building that dates to the 1750s, although there was an original coaching inn on this site as far back as the 1500s as a stopping point for people who were crossing the moor. Even today, it's a good hour's drive across. But of course, back in the old days, it was a very dangerous crossing across such a windswept and bleak part of the countryside. Now, Jamaica Inn is actually something of a big tourist stop. There's a restaurant, gift shop, and you can stay in the inn, just as you could hundreds of years ago. But now, of course, it has all the creature comforts, including indoor plumbing. But if you're a fan of Daphne du Maurier, who lived in and wrote about Cornwall, it's an important pilgrimage site that you can stop at and get a feel for the story. There is actually a recent version that came out a couple of years ago. It's a mini-series from the BBC that stars a number of fairly well-known British actors, and the lead in the story is a woman who played one of the daughters on Downton Abbey, and it's a very good production of the story. In addition to the other wildlife, there are actually otters, although we didn't see any in Bodmin Moor. At the south edge of the moor, there are a couple of interesting Neolithic sites to see. This first one is called the Hurler's Stone Circles, which is near the village of Minions. And although it's not as dramatic as something like Stonehenge or Avebury Circle, it is several thousand years old and dates from about that same time period, about 3000 BC or so. The stones are only about the height of a human being, but it's still a very atmospheric site. The name comes from a legend where people were doing the ancient sport of hurling, and they were turned into stones, and that's where the name comes from. There are actually 3 stone circles out on this, this open heathland. And just a couple of miles away from that is another very dramatic site called Trevithick Quoit. And it's a tomb. You'll see a number of similar archaeological sites around Britain. And like those other sites, this would have originally been covered with earth and been a large mound, much larger than the stones that you see here. The dirt would have been piled up over the height of the stones. The capstone that you can see on the top is 9 feet high and weighs 10 tons. This tomb also goes back to about the same age as the circles, which is 3,500 BC. And although it looks like we're in the middle of nowhere, we're actually right behind a perfectly ordinary suburban yard. There were houses that just looked out into the over their back fences to see this. There was a lot of tin mining in all over Cornwall, particularly in the inland portions, and you can still see remnants of the Industrial Revolution era buildings. Also not far from that is a beautiful little church in a village called St. Neot. This lovely parish church is way over on the west edge of the moor and was built in the 15th century. It's particularly known for its very fine stained glass, which dates from the 15th and 16th centuries almost to the founding of the church. And it's in superb condition. One of the crosses that you can see in this picture was supposedly given by King Alfred to St. Neot when he visited the village back in the late 800s. That's how far back this goes. And here's an unfortunate individual in the churchyard who was named Matthew Krapp. But inside there's a beautiful barrel vaulted ceiling, a lovely carved wooden rood screen. And here you can see the creation window, which is in the east end of the church and is one of the earliest and least touched or restored in the entire church. It's really exquisite. And here's a view of the ceiling in the porch. Many of the churches, as you can imagine, are built out of local granite because it's the most available building material. Other than the church, there's not a whole lot to do in St. Neot because it's extremely tiny, but there's a nice little village store if you want to stop for something. And a little further down is this pleasant lane that goes off into some parkland and takes you to a miraculous well, which supposedly contained 3 fish. And as long as you took only 1 fish out of the well, it would never decrease and always provide food. A little further to the west is the highlight of the region, Lanhydrock, which is a fantastic country house owned now by the National Trust. And if you like Downton Abbey, this is a little bit of Downton Abbey for real. And I would highly recommend going here if you go to no other country homes. It's one of the largest houses in all of southwestern England. The name refers to St. Hydrock, and the property goes back several hundred years, although most of what you see today is from a house that was built in the 1600s, and then after a substantial fire in the 1880s, it was rebuilt in much the same style. There are beautiful gardens as well, and the entire property covers about 900 acres. So in addition to the formal gardens right around the house, there's plenty of other areas to explore as well. The house is U-shaped, and it's entered through a gatehouse and a formal courtyard. That's the main entrance. The gatehouse was built in the 1650s as a hunting lodge. Here's a close-up of it, and it's now a museum. There's fantastic topiary all over the gardens. And the interior of the house has over 50 rooms to explore, all of which are in the high Victorian style And it really has one of the best expositions I've ever seen of the upstairs, downstairs idea, so that you can really see how a large country home like this would have been run on a daily basis. And this is a view looking back out the front entrance towards the gatehouse. Inside, most of the house, like the dining room that you can see here, is in the Jacobean Revival style, a high Victorian style that owes a lot also to William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. So you'll see a lot of that type of style throughout the home as well. Despite it being so huge, many of the rooms are actually relatively modest in scale. I wouldn't say it's a livable house like one that you'd have in Wakefield, but it's actually a very pleasant home, and you can imagine actually living here a little bit. This is his lordship's bedroom, which is fairly modest for a house this size, although it's worth pointing out that the wallpaper is actually a reproduction of hanging in the House of Lords, so it's not as modest as it might seem at first. Here's his bathroom, and her ladyship's bedroom and boudoir as well. The family drawing room. There are a number of important public rooms throughout the house that would have been used on state occasions and big public entertainments, but there's also a number of very comfortable private rooms that the family would have used by themselves. Here's a small sitting room, an office, and a billiard room. The billiard room originally, before the house was redone after the fire, was once a brew house. They made their own ales here on the site. Afterwards, it became more of a retreat for male entertaining. And it's worth noting that this house was very much divided into different spheres of life and entertaining. The men had their own part of the house where they spent time. The women had their own. The upstairs and downstairs staff had their own. And there was a very public-private division, and also one based on age. There's an entire wing that's devoted exclusively to the caring of the children and the servants who cared for them. The most dramatic room in the entire house is the long hall. And this is original. This is one of the parts of the house that was not damaged by the fire in the 1880s. It was originally paired with another room on the opposite wing that was since destroyed. This room is 115 feet long and is used as an art gallery and a library. The plaster ceiling, which is incredibly dramatic, dates to the late 16th century. And it depicts scenes from the Book of Genesis. You might wonder, it looks a little dingy because it is just plain uncovered plasterwork, and you might wonder why they haven't touched it up with a nice coat of paint at some point. And the reason for that is that it is so large and so delicate that if you painted it, the weight of the paint would actually be a problem and destabilize it. So they have left it in its original state. The library is actually full of impressive printed works, including a number of very early things. 25 of the items in the collection are from before the year 1500. Here's a William Morris wallpaper print and the servants' bells to call servants from one part of the home to the other. And as I mentioned, it's really, I think, one of the most exciting parts of the visit is to see the incredibly extensive servants' rooms throughout the house that show you the incredible number of people that would have been necessary to make a place like this run. The kitchen is designed in the style of an old college hall with a very high ceiling and clear story windows and an enormous fireplace that is used for cooking and has spits that can roast entire animals, and in fact several of them at once. There's a good 20 rooms, separate rooms in the kitchen area. This is the meat larder. There's a number of food preparation areas. This is a close-up of the spit that could cook a number of different things at once. The dishwashing and drying room. There was a separate bakehouse and pastry room. And you're free to explore all of these areas. Up in the attics, where you will find many of the servants' bedrooms and sleeping quarters, this is a room that was devoted entirely to storing luggage for the family. And more prosaically, on the second floor, again, this was before indoor plumbing, so on the second floor where most of the family stayed and all their bedrooms were, they would have had these kinds of bedpans that would have been used during the night, and they were emptied through this special room that had a sluice. It's called the sluice room, that allowed them from the second floor to wash these out and drain them out through the sewer system on the property. A view from the hill behind the house just shows you what a massive scale this house has. There are 16 chimneys in this photo alone. Over on the right-hand side is the wing where the nursery was. There's about 10 rooms for the children of the family, and also all of the nannies and other servants that would have, governesses and so forth, that would have taken care of the children and kept them completely separate. Attached to the home also is the Church of St. Hydrox, which dates from the mid-15th century, and several members of the house's family are buried there. There's about 22 acres of formal gardens that include the kitchen garden, topiary gardens, and so forth. And then, of course, there are hundreds of acres of parkland that you can go hiking in, horseback riding, and so forth. This is the back of the home. And again, a view out over the spectacular countryside. The long hall that has the incredible ceiling is on the second floor of this long wing on the east of the house. Moving on, we're going to start heading west again in the capital of Cornwall, which is Truro. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually smaller than Wakefield, despite being the capital. And it's completely dominated by its cathedral. We stayed in this lovely country house hotel, the Alverton, which is within walking distance of the downtown area. It was built in the 1830s as a manor house, but then converted to a nunnery for several decades before becoming a hotel in the post-war period in the 20th century. It's quite luxurious, although not anywhere near as expensive as you might think it was. This is one of the nicer rooms that I've stayed in. And this is a view from our bathroom, which was huge. And in fact, they are so luxurious that they have very nice services for dogs, should you happen to be traveling with one or two. The Brits love their dogs, and you will find them in shops, restaurants, and even in hotels. And places like this are very happy to cater to them. The hotel has an attached chapel and a great hall from when it was first built, and those areas are now used as function facilities for conferences and weddings and so forth. You can see over on the right the window where our room and bathroom was. There's also a very good restaurant on the property. Now, downtown in Truro, which is about a 10-minute walk away, the cathedral completely dominates the small downtown. And interestingly, it is not an old cathedral. It was built in 1910 in the Gothic Revival style. And it really gives Truro a feel of being an old European cathedral town. This is the public library. Truro was originally a center for the tin mining industry. Now it's more of a pleasant market town. It's not overly touristy, and it actually makes a very good base in the center of the peninsula. So if you want to take easy day trips around the area and come back to the same place each night, it's very centrally located for that. There's a lot of shops and restaurants. There are some small museums and beautiful architecture. And actually a number of little lanes and even canals. This is called Squeeze Guts Alley. And it almost has a feel of Amsterdam with little canals running behind many of the buildings. Late at night, the Alverton Hotel gets lit up and is very beautiful. Now, we didn't actually get out, as you might think you're supposed to, all the way to the extreme western point of Cornwall, which is known as Land's End. It's as far west as you can get in Europe, or at least in Great Britain, at least. Unfortunately, the weather really didn't cooperate, so we didn't bother to go all the way out there because we wouldn't have been able to see anything. We decided instead, on a better day, to go to the southernmost point of England, which is called Lizard Point. And it has similar dramatic rocky coastline, and it's home to the Lizard Point Lifeboat Station, which, if you're interested in maritime history, is a great place to stop. There is a lighthouse and the lifeboat station. There's a lot of interesting plant life and sea life, seabirds particularly, on the rocks. Here are some magpies. These aren't seabirds, but they're very beautiful, and you see them all over England in the countryside. I'm not sure what these little succulent plants were, but they were growing all over the cliffs. And it makes a good starting point for some great coastal walks. You can pretty much walk all the way around southwest England along the cliffs. Britain makes a point of trying to connect all of its coastline with publicly maintained walkways. And if you do, particularly on a good day, you'll see just unbelievable views up and down the coastline. The one thing you have to be careful of is there is a lot of livestock. You'll find plenty of cows and sheep, so if you walk across the fields, be careful. Heading further west, the biggest attraction in the very far west of Cornwall is St. Michael's Mount, which is in the broad bay of Penzance on the south coast of Cornwall. It's the counterpart to Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, which you may have either visited or at least seen photos of, although it's much smaller than that. And it's dedicated, of course, to the same saint. You can see way off in the distance is Penzance, as in the Pirates of. The mount is on a tidal island, so if low tide happens to coincide with your visit, there is a causeway that you can walk across to get to the island. At high tide, which was the case when we were there, you have to take a very quick boat trip, barely 10 minutes or so. It was actually kind of rough weather when we were there. The mount has a very long history. It goes back to being a monastery in the 8th century, and then the castle and the chapel were built in the Middle Ages, and it was significantly rebuilt in the 19th century during the Romantic era, so much of what you visit today is a more romanticized version of a medieval castle, but it's extremely beautiful, and the views are fantastic. The little port where the boat docks has some shops and houses. At its height, a couple of centuries ago, there would have been over 200 people living on the mount in the village and serving the castle. Queen Victoria visited in 1846, and you can see where she stepped off the boat because there is actually a little monument to her feet. Looking back towards the mainland, the town that faces St. Michael's Mount is called Marazion. And in this photo, you can just see a pale white line that goes from the breakwater back towards the village, and that is the causeway that is now submerged because it's high tide. If the tide were low, you can walk right across that in just a few minutes. The castle is still the home. This is not a National Trust property. It's actually privately owned, and it's still home to the St. Aubin family, who have lived there continuously since the 17th century. As creepy and fantastic as it looks, it's surprisingly comfortable in the interior. This is probably the largest room in the entire castle. Many of the rooms are actually quite small and cozy, and you feel almost like you're on a boat in the middle of a storm looking out over the ocean. These are the blue drawing rooms done in Gothic Revival style. If the weather is nice, which unfortunately was not the case when we were there, you can explore the terraced gardens that go all the way down to the sea. Cornwall, like much of England and Ireland, is influenced by the warmth of the Gulf Stream. So there's actually very mild winters in this area, and gardens flourish with a variety of plants that wouldn't necessarily grow that far north otherwise. This is the entrance to the church. From the terraces, you can see up and down the coast. And here, actually, this is a better view of the entrance to the original church, which is the oldest part of the structure, dating to the 12th century. And we're going to keep going a little further west, and this is on the far west of the Bay of Penzance, looking back towards the mount. You can see it off in the mist in the distance on the right. The town of Mousel, which is spelled mousehole but pronounced Mousel, has a very long history, but mostly now it's just a quaint little fishing village that gets most of its income from tourism. And it's built around this charming little protected harbor with a granite breakwater. It has lots of little narrow streets, is very popular with surfers, and almost has a New England feel because of the large amount of granite construction in all the local houses. You could almost feel like you were in Rockport, Massachusetts. It's also known for its annual festival that claims that the town is the origin of a local, I hesitate to call it a delicacy, called Stargazy pie, which you can see in the inset. It's a baked pie that has fish, pilchards, whiting, that sort of thing, that are actually poking their heads out of the pie. That's why it's called Stargazy pie. I actually would love to have tried this, but I think the locals don't actually eat it in real life. We never saw it on any restaurant menu, nor did we see it in any shops. Unfortunately, it was pouring rain when we were in Mousel, which is why we didn't bother going all the way to the end of Land's End. But it's highly recommended if the weather is pleasant. Heading back east, we're going to stop at the Gwenet Parish Church, which is another one of those tiny villages that has virtually nothing in it except a spectacular parish church, which, if you're interested in medieval architecture, is well worth a visit. It's considered one of the prettiest parish churches in the country. The foundation is very old, but the current building dates from about the 1600s. And it's unusual in that the bell tower for the church is separate rather than being integrated into the church building. It also has really nice stained glass and a stunning churchyard that's very atmospheric. Not too far east, again, past the town, the fairly large town of St. Austell, is one of the country's most popular botanical gardens. The English love their gardens, and they love botanical gardens as well. This is a fairly recent project. It was completed around the year 2000, and it's constructed on the site of an abandoned clay pit. There are several interconnected geodesic domes. They're much bigger than they actually look, and they're huge and allow for full-size trees and plantings for different parts of the world. And again, the weather really wasn't cooperating while we were there. It was very traditional Cornish weather with lots of wind and rain. But this is actually a good place to go on a day like that, because although there's a lot of exterior gardens, there's more than enough to see inside under the domes. You could spend an entire day doing nothing but that. Inside the domes, there are two major areas. One is devoted to Mediterranean type plantings, and the other is devoted to tropical plantings. At the top of the tropical biome is a catwalk that you can go up to a viewing platform where you can see everything from high up. It's a good 200 feet high, so there are full-size palm trees here. And in addition to the greenhouses, there are also, there's an environmental education center that has all kinds of exhibits about plant life and ecology, as well as an art museum with plant-inspired art exhibits. This is a 20-foot tall stone sculpture, completely made out of stone, that's supposed to evoke a seed or a pollen grain. And also in that education center is this enormous 25-foot tall interactive sculpture that is ceramic. It's supposed to recall the early cyanobacteria that began to produce oxygen on Earth 3 billion years ago, and were part of the march of the early development of life. It periodically puffs out rings of steam, which make it really popular with the kids and grown-ups too. The exhibits in the Eden Project are very extensive, and they have a lot of really informative signs that talk about where plants come from, what their uses are, whether it's medicinal, food, and so forth. There's also a certain amount of wildlife, mostly birds, and some insects that you'll see in the undergrowth as you walk around. There are plans to build a similar project way up in the north of England on the Lancashire coast. I haven't heard recently whether that's expected to go forward, but it would be a big boost to the tourism region in that part of the country if they manage to do that. On the way back down to the coast, again, we're heading back east. I just enjoyed this sign that seemed very British to me. There's a self-service car park where, in order to pay for your parking, they just ask you to put it in the milk churn. We're going to head to a series of small towns along the southern coast. Polperro is one that's on an inlet at the mouth of the River Pol. Many of these villages that we'll see, including this one, are very old and were originally fishing villages or even smuggling villages that go back as early as the 1200s. This whole stretch of coast was very much known for smuggling. And also pilchard fishing. Pilchards are a kind of herring. Here's a pub called the Three Pilchards. Now many of these villages make most of their money not from fishing, but from tourism, particularly in the summer. But since we were there in the fall, it was much quieter and you had almost had the place to yourself. The narrow streets wend their way down to the little harbor, which is completely enclosed, like most of these towns, by a granite breakwater. Obviously, it's low tide, as you can see here. It very much has a coastal feel to it. And if you get all the way to the end of the harbor, there is actually a very small beach at the river mouth that's protected by cliffs. A little further east is another town, similar but a bit larger, and even older. Foy goes back to the 7th century, and it is at the mouth of the River Foy, which opens out into a very wide estuary and harbor. The history parallels that of Bulpero, with boat building, fishing, pilchards again, and smuggling too. The parish church can be seen over on the right, and the funny tower in the center of this is a private mansion that is still privately owned. The wide river mouth is full of boats, mostly pleasure boats at this point, although a few fishing boats. On the opposite is a separate town called Polruan, and there are lots of shops, restaurants, cafes to browse around in. And of course, if it's chilly and you're tired, you should feel free to stop for a Cornish pasty, which you can get pretty much every 25 feet in any of the villages in Cornwall. Again, moving back east, we'll stop in Loo, which is another one of these small fishing ports. It's actually the Loos because there's an East Loo and West Loo on either side of the River Loo. It's a very hilly little town with narrow streets, the same kind of coastal stone houses, many of which are whitewashed. It's a very touristy town now, so there's gift shops and pubs and restaurants and so forth. I've thought that they are actually missing a little bit of tourist humor because, of course, loo is also the word for a toilet in British. And I've often thought that they should have the public loos of loo and so forth, but they don't seem to be making as much of that as I think they could. Looking across to East Loo, you can see the other side of the river. East Loo actually has quite a nice beach. The whole area, like this entire coast, has a number of sandy beaches, high cliffs where you can go walking and get great views up and down the coast. We're going to finish in another country home that's quite a bit different from some of the others, called Coteal. It's one of the least altered of the Tudor era houses in all of Britain and goes back to 1300, although much of the house that you see dates to about a century later. The apple display that you see in the front is because of an orchard festival that they were having. Coteal has extensive apple orchards with about 250 apple trees, and this was the right time of year, so they were having all kinds of activities around that. The property is huge. It's about 1,300 acres and includes a number of different buildings, including a mill on the River Tamar and other places that you can visit. But the highlight is the main house, which is the ancestral home of the Edgecombe family. It's made of local granite and slate, as you might imagine, because it's the easiest accessible building material in the area. It's built around a central courtyard, and the East Range, which you can see on this side here, the back side of it, faces formal gardens and was remodeled completely in the 19th century, so it's a bit more comfortable. But the oldest part of the house is very interesting to visit because it's so close to the original Tudor interior with many original furnishings and decorative arts from that time period to give you a better idea of what life would have been like in a home of that time period. You'll remember from Lanhydrock, the other country house that we visited, that was very much, although it was a Jacobean revival style, it was very much a Downton Abbey era lifestyle. So the late 1900s and early 20th century, I'm sorry, late 1800s and early 20th century. But Coteal depicts a life several centuries earlier than that. There is all kinds of early furniture, tapestries, um, arms and armor, and other kinds of decorative arts. This is one of several bedrooms with tapestries in it. And the old drawing room in the high tower, which was used also as a dining room. At the other end of the room, you can see the carved oak entrance. Here's another bedroom and the stained glass in the chapel that's built into the home. And like most of the other country homes, you can also explore backstairs. Here's one of the servants' bells. And you can explore the kitchens and the servants' areas to see what it would have been like to work in and run a Tudor-era home. The house really nestles into the side of a slope. It's not built on a hill. It almost feels like it's being swallowed up by the surrounding countryside. And on a gray day like this, it actually has kind of a gloomy, haunted feel to it. The northwest tower, where that dining room was located and many of the bedrooms, is the tallest part of the house and also one of the oldest sections. Over on the east side are lovely formal gardens below the east wing of the house. So that concludes our tour of Cornwall. If you're heading back to Devon, which I hope you'll see in another one of my presentations, I hope you'll stop in the little village of Splat. I always like to find the strangest named places along my route. And in other programs, we're going to be spending time visiting some of the pretty seaside towns on the Devon coast, and also heading up north to Somerset and Oxfordshire. So that's it for now. Thank you again for traveling with me. I hope you will join me again, either at the library, where I will be doing monthly programs once the library reopens, online, or on WCAT for more destinations. And again, feel free, if you'd like to see other worldwide armchair travel destinations, follow me on Instagram at #the_traveling_librarian. And keep exploring. See you soon.